The first body was found where the city tried not to look. Down by the Green River, where the current slid past cottonwoods and the bank turned to mud, a teenage girl lay face down, cold and still. It was July 1982 in King County, Washington. The detectives who stood over her worked plenty of violent cases, but this felt different, like the start of a long sentence no one had agreed to serve. The victim was identified as Wendy Caulfield. Her name would be followed by many others. Within weeks, more girls vanished from the Highway 99 corridor south of Seattle, the strip of motels, parking lots, and late-night businesses where women tried to make rent one ride at a time. Many were involved in sex work or survival sex, taking rides from strangers because they needed money and because there were few safer options. The killer seemed to understand exactly which disappearances would be slowed by stigma and brushed off as choices instead of emergencies. By the time parents were filing missing reports and begging officers to keep looking, the women were already beyond reach, and bodies were being left in places a stranger would never find by accident. The Green River Task Force formed quickly, pulling in King County detectives and outside agencies. Investigators mapped dump sites, compared missing person reports, and drove the same roads again and again, looking for patterns in a landscape of trees, gravel pull-offs, and river access points. Detectives collected whatever the early 1980s could offer: hairs, fibers, rope impressions, cigarette butts, and semen samples. They photographed bodies where they lay, measured distances from roads, and logged every detail that might connect one death to the next. Even then, they suspected the evidence might need to wait for the future. As months turned into years, the killer's habits began to show through the noise. Many victims had been strangled, several were dumped in clusters, suggesting the killer returned to familiar spots and felt safe doing it. Some victims were found near the river and in wooded ravines. Others were discovered farther south, as if the killer was expanding his comfort zone. The task force ran stings with decoys and heavy patrols along the strip, watching for drivers who slowed too long, who asked practiced questions, who seemed to know how to get a frightened woman into a car without causing a scene. The work was relentless, and it often ended with nothing more than another name added to a list. One name surfaced early and kept resurfacing: Gary Leon Ridgway. He lived locally and worked at the Kenworth truck plant as a painter, a steady job that left paint residue in his world the way sawdust follows a carpenter. He looked like the kind of man who could blend into a break room and never be remembered. In 1983, after a sex worker reported that a man had tried to strangle her in a vehicle but she fought him off and escaped, Ridgway drew attention. Detectives questioned him. He denied harming anyone. He provided samples. But suspicion in that era was not proof, and prosecutors needed evidence that could survive court, not just a strong feeling in a detective's stomach. In 1984, Ridgway took a polygraph and appeared deceptive on key questions. It sharpened the focus on him, but it still didn't close the case. The task force was under relentless pressure to stop the killings and to do it the right way. A wrong arrest would destroy credibility, and worse, leave the real killer free. Ridgway remained on the list, interviewed, watched, then left in the world where he could keep moving through ordinary routines while detectives chased hundreds of other leads. Investigators did everything they could think to do. They spoke with women who survived frightening encounters and tried to reconstruct faces from memory that was blurred by fear. They tracked tips from jailhouse informants and people seeking attention. They compared vehicle descriptions, built timelines, and filled binders with suspects who later evaporated under scrutiny. At one point, detectives even consulted Ted Bundy, who was imprisoned in Florida, hoping one predator might recognize another's behavior. Bundy's suggestions were cold and practical. The killer might return to dump sites, might feel ownership over the bodies, might be able to appear harmless until the moment he decided not to be. Over time, the killings slowed. but the case never went away. Families kept photographs on walls and candles burning in windows. Detectives carried the file forward through promotions, retirements, and budget changes, moving boxes of evidence as the task force shrank and expanded. What remained constant was the evidence itself, sealed and preserved with the belief that science would eventually catch up to the violence. That choice, saving what could be saved, would become the hinge the entire case turned on. By the late 1990s, it did. DNA technology had advanced enough to turn old biological samples into clean profiles. Detectives reopened Green River evidence and sent preserved samples for modern testing. A profile emerged that pointed back to Ridgway. The name that had hovered on the edge of the case for years was suddenly centered by something that did not rely on memory, rumor, or fear. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was arrested. He was 52 years old. The man who had lived in plain sight was now sitting in an interview room across from investigators who had spent decades staring at photographs of the dead. The case was no longer a collection of suspicions. It was a forensic chain, strengthened by additional links, including tiny paint spheres consistent with the type of industrial painting Ridgway did at work. In 2003, prosecutors offered Ridgway a deal. If he pleaded guilty and cooperated, helping locate remains and providing information, the death penalty would be removed. For families, it felt like bargaining with a fire. Many wanted a public trial that named every victim and forced every detail into the light. Many wanted the maximum punishment possible. But a plea meant certainty. Life in prison with no possibility of release, and a chance to recover at least some remains for families who had never had a funeral, never had a grave to visit, never had a final answer. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. In court, he spoke with a flat detachment that drained the oxygen from the room, describing killings in the language of routine. He led investigators to locations where he said victims had been left, though time, weather, and animals had already erased much. Prosecutors said they believed the true number of his victims was higher than the counts he admitted, and Ridgway claimed he had killed more than he pleaded to. The Green River case became a lesson written in real lives. It exposed how predators exploit the vulnerable and how stigma can buy a killer time. It proved the value of saving evidence even when the tools are not yet good enough to read it. And it left a permanent scar across Washington. Young women taken from streets and parking lots, families living through years of uncertainty, and an entire region shaped by the knowledge that a killer moved among ordinary routines until the day the evidence finally caught up to him. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.